The scientist had spent years mourning the loss of his family, the pain of their sudden departure in a tragic airplane crash, never truly fading. His days were consumed by grief, his nights haunted by memories of their laughter, their voices, the warmth of their presence. The emptiness of his home was unbearable, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Driven by desperation and an unyielding love for his wife and children, he turned to the one thing he knew best: science. As a brilliant geneticist, he had dedicated his life to pushing the boundaries of what was possible, and now he saw a way to defy death itself. The idea of cloning his family began as a fleeting thought, a wild fantasy born from sorrow, but it quickly took root in his mind, growing into an obsession. He convinced himself that if he could bring them back, even through artificial means, he could undo the cruel hand of fate. With meticulous precision, he gathered every remaining DNA sample he could find: strands of hair left in brushes, old toothbrushes, clothing fibers, anything that contained traces of their genetic material. His laboratory became his sanctuary, the only place where he felt close to them. The process was painstaking, fraught with ethical dilemmas and scientific hurdles, but his determination never wavered. He worked in secret, knowing the world would never understand, that they would condemn him for playing God. But in his mind, this wasn't about playing God, it was about justice, about correcting an unbearable wrong. After years of relentless effort, the impossible became reality. The clones began to grow, first as cells in petri dishes, then as embryos, and finally as living, breathing replicas of his lost family. The day they awoke was both triumphant and surreal. Their faces were identical, their voices eerily familiar, yet there was something undeniably different about them. At first, he dismissed the unease in his chest, attributing it to the strangeness of the situation. He had expected an immediate reconnection, a seamless return to the life he once had, but the clones were not exact copies. They carried the same genetic code, but their experiences, their memories, their very souls, if such a thing existed, were not the same. His wife's clone looked at him with recognition, but without the depth of shared history. His children's clones behaved like them, but lacked the nuances that made them uniquely his. He tried to force normalcy, to pretend that everything was as it should be, but the cracks in his plan began to show almost immediately. The clones were not human in the way he had hoped. They learned quickly, mimicking the behaviors and speech patterns of the originals. But there was an emptiness behind their eyes, a hollowness that unsettled him. They asked questions he couldn't answer, spoke of things they shouldn't know, and sometimes stared at him with an unsettling intensity. His wife's clone would recite conversations they'd had years ago, word for word, yet when he tried to engage her in new ones, she would fall silent, as if waiting for a script she didn't have. His children's clones played together just as they had before, but their laughter was just a fraction too loud, their movements just a little too precise. He tried to ignore it, to convince himself that they just needed time to adjust, but the truth was inescapable. They were imitations, not replacements. As weeks turned into months, the scientist's initial joy gave way to a gnawing dread. The clones began to exhibit strange behaviors, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. They would sometimes speak in unison, their voices blending into one as if connected by an unseen thread. They developed habits the originals never had. Standing, too still, watching him when they thought he wasn't looking, whispering to each other in a language he didn't recognize. His wife's clone would sometimes touch his face with a cold, detached curiosity, as if studying him rather than loving him. His children's clones would play games that made no sense, constructing elaborate patterns with their toys that seemed to follow some hidden logic. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that cloning was an imperfect science, that differences were to be expected, but deep down, he knew something was terribly wrong. Then the nightmares began. He would wake in the middle of the night to find them standing at the foot of his bed, motionless, their eyes gleaming in the dark. They never spoke during these visits, never moved, just watched him with an unnerving patience. When he confronted them the next morning, they would deny it, their expressions blank, their voices calm. He started locking his door, but it made no difference. They always found a way in. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt like a prison, every creak of the floorboards setting his nerves on edge. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the grief had finally driven him mad. But the evidence was there, undeniable. The clones were changing, becoming something he didn't understand. One night he awoke to the sound of whispering outside his door. Not the usual hushed murmurs, but a chorus of voices speaking in perfect sync, their words too low to decipher. His heart pounded as he crept out of bed, pressing his ear against the wood. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Swallowing his fear, he yanked the door open, only to find the hallway empty. But the air was thick with a presence, a weight that hadn't been there before. He called out their names, his voice trembling, but no one answered. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that felt deliberate, as if something was holding its breath. He checked their rooms one by one, but they weren't there. The beds were neatly made, untouched, as if no one had slept in them at all. It wasn't until he reached the laboratory that he found them. They were standing in a circle around the cloning chamber, their backs to him, their heads bowed. The air hummed with an unnatural energy, the machines flickering erratically, though he knew the power had been shut off hours ago. He called out to them, demanding to know what they were doing. But they didn't turn. Instead, in unison, they raised their hands, pressing them against the glass of the chamber. The liquid inside, once clear, had turned dark, swirling as if alive. A deep, resonant tone filled the room, vibrating through his bones, and for the first time, he felt true terror. This wasn't his family. Whatever he had created, whatever he had brought back, it was something else entirely. He stumbled back, his mind racing. He had been so focused on the science, on the mechanics of resurrection, that he had never stopped to consider what else might come through. The clones turned to face him then, their eyes black and endless, their smiles stretching too wide. In that moment, he understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had not just defied death, he had invited something into the world that should never have been allowed to exist. The last thing he heard, as the darkness swallowed him whole, was their voices, whispering together in perfect harmony. "We remember now.